Hey, y'all. Thanks for listening to Thought Feeder. This is an episode with Jenny Petty that we recorded back in 2021, so we're considering this a lost episode. We hope you enjoy it. Welcome to the Thought Feeder podcast. My name is Joel Goodman. With me, as always, is the unflappable John Steven Stansel. And we are so excited to have Jenny Petty on the show today. Jenny is the VP of Marketing and Communications at the University of Montana. And we're going to have an awesome conversation. Jenny, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm big fans of both of you, so I'm excited to be here.
Oh, it's nice to have fans. Thanks.
Well, we're fans of you as well. So we've got a lot to talk about. So first, just tell us a bit about yourself. What do you do at the University of Montana? What does your daily life look like? Just the basic intro.
Yeah, so I came to the University of Montana about 4 months ago. This is my first CMO, CCO gig. I came from the University of Wyoming, where I led the enrollment and brand marketing there for about 6 years. So I've been in higher ed for about 7 years, and before that I came from the private sector. So I worked for a lot of different industries and companies directly before I came to higher ed. And I've been told not to tell people this, but I'm a woman of candor, so I'll share with you that I came from the gaming industry. I worked for the world's largest manufacturer of gaming equipment and games. And that was a pretty formative experience for me as a marketer. So I'm not ashamed of it, although it was like the seedier side of the private sector, but it was a great gig. At the University of Montana, I took this job because a couple of reasons. One, I was ready to grow and stretch. The president here is phenomenal, and this was a cabinet level position, and that's what I was looking for. And in addition to that, they're in a building stage here. So right now my day-to-day is a lot of, we're getting ready to launch into a brand process. We're growing and reshaping what the marketing communications team here looks like. There's just a lot of work to be done to grow and rebuild. And so as a first-time CMO, I'm learning a lot of things by fire and making mistakes for the first time in a long time, and really enjoying this new chapter of my career.
That's awesome. And now we have a ton of stuff to unpack based upon that. So first, I did not know about your background in the gaming industry, which is very interesting because I'm starting to dabble my toes into the gaming industry from higher ed. So this wasn't on our questions board, but now I want to know, what can higher ed learn from the gaming industry, and maybe even invite vice versa a little bit? Like, what do you see there?
So I came from, the world's largest manufacturer, and they did so many things. They had been around for a really long time. And I was part of a global marketing department. So there was, 100 plus people that lived in our marketing group. And I think what I learned from that experience was the power of marketing when you're in an institution or organization, that marketing is just woven into the institutional strategy. And I think that's an area where higher ed can struggle sometimes, is that for so long, higher ed has looked at marketing as the output shop or the promotion shop. And I think we are on the cusp of this great new era where, for the wisest organizations out there, they will look at marketing as a strategic partner, which is why I was attracted to the University of Montana. So many things. Taking marketing, as strategic institutional strategy, staffing it appropriately, having salaries be appropriate. I think there's a lot of things that higher ed can learn from the private sector when it comes to the way that a marketing group is organized and managed. For a person like you, JS, who would be going the opposite way, I think there probably would be areas that you find incredibly refreshing about the private sector. I also think that folks who might be moving from higher ed to the private sector might also find cultural issues or culture challenging in the private sector. I know I came from a group that, although it was 100 plus and we were highly functioning and we put out award-winning amazing work, the inside of the group was incredibly competitive. It was one of those things where the politics just within our big department were sometimes something that was tough to manage.
I would agree. I think there's a lot I'm finding is refreshing, but there's also a little bit of culture shock back and forth. But, for me, the one thing that strikes me is like in the private industry, the stakes seem higher, but the pressure seems lower in certain regards of like, we're not stressing over, we have this tiny little program and we've got to put this post out that maybe 5 people will see. There's 10 layers of approval for it, where at least my experience so far in, the private industry is like, yeah, we're launching a show this week. That post looks great. Let's do it. Which is so refreshing. Like, we trust you. We hired you for your expertise.
I would totally agree with you on that. And there was more trust and less layers of approvals and less bureaucracy. So that was a really great thing.
But on the flip side of that, what you mentioned at the University of Montana, you're coming in kind of a newer position and being able to build something from the ground up, which is incredibly exciting. Like, to kind of forge the way. So what's your method? What's your first steps do you think is going to take in doing that?
I think for any leader who steps into a group of people that you're then just expected to lead, it takes a lot of trust building and a lot of time of getting to know folks. And so we are moving really quickly here, but I'm trying to do it in a way that I bring people along with me. And there's a lot of, education of, okay, I know you've done it before this way, but we're going to do it this way and it'll be different. And I promise it's going to be better. You just got to kind of come along with me. So that first step of trust building, I spent the first month or so meeting with every single person in my department one-on-one. I had the entire department do an exercise that I really like called a stop, start, continue before I even started. So I had them fill out, for their individual role, stop, start, continue what they wanted to do, and then also collectively for the group what needed to stop, start, and continue. And so I use that as kind of my data to guide what reshaping the department will look like, as well as the 3 strategic initiatives that I figured out pretty quickly we needed to focus on. And those were enrollment marketing, taking control of the narrative around the University of Montana, and the third piece was the brand revitalization. So we're looking at not a rebrand, not anything like that, but we really need to essentially welcome in an era of like a brand renaissance here, of being prideful again of this institution.
So you mentioned a few, I guess it was kind of more on the refreshing side of things in the private sector, but you mentioned a few of the various struggles that higher ed has, and I'm wondering if you could talk to some of the main challenges that you're kind of keeping front of mind as you are building out this team, or just looking at higher ed in general. What are those couple focus points that you think the rest of higher ed also needs to work hard to address kind of in tandem?
So I think one that's top of mind for all of us is this concern about the mass exodus of talent from higher ed, and marketing communications. Those are jobs that can be done from almost anywhere. And so I think staffing is something that's concerning to me, is how am I going to, as a leader, recruit really great talent when they're going to have so many more options than they've ever had before? And how am I going to attract the really great people who need to be motivated by the service and the purpose of it? Am I going to be able to attract people based on that more than, lucrative salaries that they might be able to get in other places? I think when it comes to what the last year taught us about marketing and communications departments, and what it should have taught our organizations, is that we are a pivotal key player in helping a university weather all sorts of things, not just crisis, but we are a unit that can deliver results. We can help shape strategy. And what I'm worried a little bit about is that after we're coming out of the COVID phase, and these marketing communications departments have been taxed and stretched in ways that that maybe the university didn't know they could deliver on, I'm afraid that we might slip a little bit back into being the poster maker output shops. And so I think there's concern there. How do we keep this footing that we've gained over the last couple of years through this crisis that gave a lot of marketing communication shops the opportunity to show their true chops of how much they can do for an institution?
I think one thing along those lines, in hindsight, I don't know, because I'm not on the inside, so I'm on the agency side of things. I've been not surprised. I've just been kind of, I guess, bowled over with how much budget was left over in most institutions' marketing budgets, and how much work I have to get done by the end of it's late June. I got to get it done by the end of June, as we're recording it today. I wonder if there are any lessons to be learned. I mean, I think there are. I think there's a lesson to be learned, though. There's a lot of money that probably could have been spent to make everyone's job a little bit easier during a crisis like the pandemic, but so few institutions recognized it, or maybe it was like you were saying, they hadn't really learned how to value their Marcom organizations, the folks within the marketing department and the work that they do. But do you think that's a lesson anyone is learning? I'm just calling out because I just had that thought. Like, I don't know that I've heard anyone talking about that yet, or if that's even going to come up in this industry.
I think it's a really good point with the money left over on the table, right? We had to kind of table all of the normal operations that we would do in a year. We had to shift the way that we were reaching out to prospective students in new ways. We had to work with our admissions and our enrollment management teams in new ways. But I can say that, like, at the University of Wyoming, social media wasn't respected until we went through COVID. And then all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, I would say 6 months into it, there was this recognition like, oh, this is the place where we are communicating to all of our audiences about COVID. And then it became one of those top of mind things where I had administrators who had never cared at all before telling me what should be on Facebook, what should be on Instagram. And so in some ways, right, it's good. It brings to the top, like, the abilities of our groups, but it's also a bit frustrating because we're sitting here saying, well, it's always been this way. Now you're validating it for us, but we've always known this to be true.
Well, I think you also underscore a commonality, something that's existed in this industry for years, and that's the fact that everyone thinks they know how to do marketing's job. Whether it's the social media person's job or the social media team's job, or whether it's the CMO, or whether it's, the web person or persons, everyone thinks they know how to do their jobs. And I think there's a systemic issue, and I don't know how to tackle it because I've been trying to tackle it for 15 years, but it's not really going anywhere. But there's this, I don't know what it is. I wonder about that mentality and how do you deal with it? How are you coping with that with your team? How did you cope with it, at University of Wyoming, that sort of thing? But there's always this thought that, the president or some senior vice president over here, or, some board member or some faculty person, isn't getting what they think needs to get out of the marketing department, and they know how to do the marketing department's job better than the marketers actually do.
Yeah, so I often tell people that everyone's a consumer, so everyone thinks they're a marketer. And I think a lot of the time what we have to do as marketers is we have to compile all of this data, and we have to come in and be twice as competent to be seen half as good as what other groups might be able to do. And I talk about this with our AVP of enrollment here at UM. We have the two jobs on campus that everyone thinks they can do. And it's like nobody's ever going up to the VP of research and saying, well, let me tell you what you need to be doing. But I think because everyone's a consumer, they have that as their frame of reference. And so they know what they like. So they bring that to the table. But I think there is a massive oversimplification of the marketing field. JS, I joked with you on Twitter a long time ago about Canva because I had a friend come to me and ask me for a logo. And trying to explain to that person that I don't do logos, and trying to explain what I do and all the different layers of what marketing is, it takes a lot of time. Like if you were trying to explain performance marketing to someone who had no clue, like we'd be like, well, yeah, they're like the accountants of the marketing field. Or I don't even know what the comparison would be, but there's so many different layers within marketing, and there's so many specialties, and people do tend to completely oversimplify. You know, how many times have you had someone who's like, oh, just make a graphic or just throw this on the web? Like, it happens all the time. And there's not a deep understanding of the depth of the work that we do and the expertise it requires, and that we are a craft and a skilled profession that takes years to develop. And I've been in that situation where you're trying to convince, and you feel like you're like on the hamster wheel of trying to convince administration that you're worthy. And I don't know what the answer to that is.
And I don't want to get on my Canva kick, but that's also part of the problem too, is like that tool that everybody thinks, oh, I made this pretty thing in Canva, anybody can do this. It's like, well, that's not as good as you think it is, right? So yeah, I think that's another beef I have with that certain utility. But also to your earlier point on this, I think it is also a talent and retention issue. You know, granted, higher ed can often not pay a lot and offer some of the same benefits the private industry can, but there's the service part of it, that people that believe in the mission and want to work on a college campus. But if you can't provide the salary, at least you can provide the respect. And I think that's a big part of it, where I think a lot of people right now are on higher ed campuses. They're looking at their bank account and going, hey, this isn't that great. And then they're looking at their email going, hey, nobody really is respecting my work or my expertise and my input. And they're starting to look elsewhere. So I think it comes down to, you know, making that case to leadership. You have to listen to your marketing team or they're going to leave, right? You've got to let them feel like, and believe in them, but let them do the work that they want to do and that needs to be done.
And I'm incredibly lucky because at the University of Montana, our president, he's completely an untraditional. Like, he came from the private sector. He has an amazing background that is much deeper than that. But he came from GE before he came to the University of Montana. So he and I already have a shared language around marketing and strategic planning and the way that we fit in. And I haven't found that with many other folks in higher ed. When you're talking to a traditional president who came up through the ranks of faculty and they have their specialty that they're passionate about, trying to find a way in to their psyche of here's why I'm important to you can be really, really hard.
It's so rare, but when you find it, it's so refreshing. It's just so, and you can spot the schools that got it, you know, because their marketing's better. But yeah, that sort of leadership is really important. One thing that you spend a lot of time talking about, and I think I want to take enough time to address this because this is a big issue. You talk a lot about servant marketing. So can you briefly, or not briefly, take your time, right? Describe what servant marketing is and how we can apply this philosophy to our work?
Yeah, so I'll back up and just explain. I just recently finished my master's from Gonzaga in organizational leadership. And I chose Gonzaga because they had a servant leadership concentration. And I didn't know anything about servant leadership, but when I was looking for a master's program, I remember looking on their website and being like, wow, that's something that I need to look into. And even on the surface of understanding servant leadership, it was this like validating moment of, oh my gosh, I can lead the way that I want to lead. I don't need to lead the way that all these books are telling me, or like Sheryl Sandberg's telling me to lean in and like do all these things, right? Like, I can lead in a way that's super authentic to me. And at its core, like, servant leadership is about leaving places better than you found them, treating people with humility and care. And this creeps people out, but it's like really based in coming from a place of leadership that's based in love and not fear. And so for me, it was like really refreshing to learn about this philosophy. And then as I ended the close of my program, I had to do a capstone class that was like 16 weeks long. And I was trying to figure out what I was going to do as my capstone project. And I decided I wanted to explore the intersection of the servant leadership philosophy and the marketing profession. And I think the nugget of this, like the seed, was planted probably 4 or 5 years ago. I was on the #HigherEd podcast with Steve App, and we were talking about inbound marketing, and he had asked me, like, explain inbound marketing to people who might not, understand it. And I gave him this answer about how I felt like it was a more altruistic way of marketing, and it was really about, being out there to help consumers and attract them that way rather than like traditional means of just peppering them with advertising or things like that. And then I kind of laughed it off on the interview, like, ha ha ha, like if marketing could even be altruistic. But that seed was planted of, wait, it can't it? And so I spent this capstone project exploring that, and I produced a podcast called The Servant Marketer. And there's 22 episodes out there. I would love to pick it up again at some point when I'm not taking on a new job and moving my family and all that good stuff. But there were some pieces of really great content, I think, that help us glean what it means to be a servant marketer. And there's a couple of themes. So one of them is using our creativity responsibly. So we are all really super creative folks. We think about all sorts of ideas, but if we're just blindly putting work out into the world and assuming that it's good just because it's creative, we have to take a step back and be really reflective about the work that we do as marketers, because it's incredibly powerful and it reaches a lot of people. Another one was being dedicated students of diversity and inclusion and working to include that not just in the teams that we build, but in the work that we do in a way that's authentic to our brands and the people that we're trying to represent. Putting honesty at the center of all we do. I think marketers don't have a great reputation for being honest, and you take that back to like the days of Mad Men and the ideas that kind of sprout up in our society about marketing and advertising. But I think that was one of the core tenets, was like, let's be honest about the work that we do and what we put out into the world. And then another was just having humility and being vulnerable and open to serving the world in a way that they need from us, not just what we think the world needs. So there was a lot. There's still more work there to be done that I would love to pick back up at some point. But I think for anyone who is attracted to service, and especially folks in higher ed, there's a lot to learn from the servant leadership philosophy.
Especially from a social media standpoint, all of those pillars apply to every single aspect of a social media strategy, or even just individual bits of social media content, of looking at it from every angle with, how things can be interpreted, or who your audience is. We just had Father's Day. I think that's a big example of, hey, not everybody has great feelings about their father, or some people may have had, if their father's no longer with them, or all of these issues that we really need to take into account as we craft our content and have that empathy for our audience. But I really like that concept of using creativity responsibly. Creativity is a power. With great power comes great responsibility. Like, how are we using our creativity to make the world and our communities better?
Exactly. And we've got plenty of examples out there that we can, of when creativity has gone wrong. Alma Marfo wrote this fantastic book. She actually joined me on the podcast, and she wrote a whole book about creativity and building creativity in our teams. And one of the things that struck me with my conversation with her was, like, for creativity to take place, people have to feel safe. And so that's another piece of the servant leadership philosophy, is how do we create environments at work that can actually help people heal? And that gets kind of deep, but thinking about work in that way, we don't think about work in that way, right? Like, we think about work as show up, get a paycheck, like maybe you make some friends, but I think we can hold our workplaces to higher standards and think about them as being catalysts for major change in our lives.
I think that circles back to your point about the mass exodus happening. It's like your question, like, can you convince someone to join up based on, the mission of the institution? As a leader, you have to understand those kind of intrinsic, it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like, you're sitting there like, yes, everyone's coming into jobs just wanting to take care of their basic needs, pay their rent, buy food, take care of their, their families or their pets or, whatever. But then there's this side of, if you want them to buy into that missional aspect, that, that very, I guess, altruistic, idealistic side of what you're doing and transform the role that they're in, you have to value them and value their talents as well. And sometimes that comes with money. Sometimes that just comes with having better, care benefit packages. Like sometimes it comes with flexibility. Sometimes it's really just recognizing that every individual in your organization is independently unique.
Have either of you ever had the boss that you would like walk through fire for?
Oh yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah, so like if we had more of those, right? Like think about the stability we could offer organizations when you have those managers or leaders who are so invested in not only the results of what they're leading, but the people who are helping them get there. And I think about that a lot when it comes to servant leadership is like, how do we develop more leaders who become that person, who become the person that people would follow anywhere or do anything for? And I think for a lot of people, here's the thing about servant leadership is like, it's not easy. It requires so much self-reflection, humility, understanding our own flaws as leaders and owning up to those. Like there's a lot of awareness that has to come if you're going to be a servant leader. And there's also an understanding that you're never going to be finished on the journey to being a servant leader. Like you are always going to be a work in progress. You don't get to be like this beacon on a hill that people aspire to be. You're in it with them. And I think for some people, the idea of servant leadership is like, oh, that's too touchy-feely. Like I'll buy into this, book that tells me how to lead with 5 steps or whatever. But it's a deeper calling, I think, when you start digging into the servant leadership I don't want to call it a doctrine, but philosophy.
It comes back to, the times I've worked with that boss that I'd walk over hot coals for, the work has been better, and also vice versa, knowing that boss would walk over hot coals for me. Like it goes both ways. And back to this idea of retention, all right? We're having this problem in higher ed right now. When I left that job, like, it broke my heart. I didn't want to go. I got offered a lot more money, and my boss was like, you've got to. I'm sorry. Like, and that's part of that servant leadership of like knowing like, hey, this is an opportunity for, one of my employees to go on and take off and can do things there that we cannot provide, and being willing to let go a little bit. It's such a rare thing, but it's amazing. Absolutely.
So within servant leadership, there's these 10 characteristics that have been kind of taken out of the writings of Robert Greenleaf, who is the guy who was the first person, I guess, servant leadership has existed all through, everywhere. Like you can go look back at the Stoicism writings and Marcus Aurelius. Like it's been around for a long time, but Robert Greenleaf is the guy who wrote several books on it based on his entire career was spent at AT&T in like the 40s, 50s, 60s, a little bit of the 70s. And there's 10 characteristics that have been pulled out of those writings, and the growth of people is one of them. And sometimes that does mean letting go. Sometimes it means having really tough conversations with people about, what stage they're in and where they need to develop. And it's also looking at ourselves and thinking, well, I have to always be growing as well. I can't just be the leader who tells people what to do and doesn't actually understand the work that they're doing.
I've been thinking about that a lot lately, and Stoic philosophy is kind of making a bit of a comeback, but I think it's coming back for the wrong reasons. I think there's this misconception of this like manly, quiet, introspective, I'm going to think about death for an hour, thing of Stoicism, but it's also about empathy. It's about being a servant. It's about being the kind of leader who's open and caring in ways. And I think that part of the philosophy is just lost on about 70% of the people that get into it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is kind of there's that masculine tone to, like, I love Ryan Holiday's books. I've read them. Like, I think he's phenomenal, but I do think there is kind of this like hyper masculine take on it right now that is, like, here's the new way to be a man. Like, let's look at the old way of being a man kind of thing. So, I don't know. I enjoy his writing, but I think suspending the ego is something a lot of us can learn, especially in marketing. So,
but this humility aspect of just getting rid of your pride, right? And because I think like once you can set aside this idea that you know everything, you are or at least like I don't even think you have to get rid of the mentality that you know everything. It's just you don't have to like tell everyone that you know everything all the time, right? It's more about treating other people with respect, and a big part of that is just being able to set aside that ego, that pridefulness, and then everything else can follow after that.
Right. And I think when you can get to that space, it can be a really amazing transformational time for your career. And I'm trying to be really conscious of that as stepping into like my first CMO role, is being humble about it. Like, no, I'm going to make mistakes. I'm not perfect. I'm doing this for the first time. I'm being stretched in new ways. I'm stepping into leadership in new ways that I never have before. And I want, people to know that they can come to me with feedback. They can say, hey, you didn't handle this the way I would have. And I'm open to that, and I want to hear it. And at the same time, while being respected for the knowledge and the career I bring with me to this position experience, I think there's a fear, right? A fear of, if you're not the smartest person in the room, that you're not the leader. And I don't subscribe to that at all. I love hiring people who are way smarter than me because it makes my job so much easier. I love learning from folks who work for me who are just brilliant. And I think a lot of leaders have a hard time when you transition from an individual contributor role to being a leader. It's like the more you ascend, the further you get away from the work. And when you love the work, it's really hard sometimes not to step back in and say, insert yourself in ways that you shouldn't be inserted. And that can be really hard. And I think we've all probably had examples of leaders who can't do that, who can't step back. And that's when you end up with the micromanagers or the leaders who are staying up into the middle of the night doing tasks that they should be delegating. And so I try to stay really conscious of that, of making sure that I'm secure enough and confident enough in my abilities and knowledge to also know what I don't know.
I think about this quote from a short-lived television show, Sports Night by Aaron Sorkin, but it says, if you're not smart, surround yourself with smart people. If you are smart, surround yourself with smart people who disagree with you. And I kind of want to edit that quote from disagree to like maybe challenge you. But I think about that a lot. It's like, yes, iron sharpens iron, right? You want to work with other people that are smart in ways that you are not, or, and it only makes you better. This idea that we have to be the smartest person in the room all the time, it's so damaging to everybody.
And it's exhausting. It's exhausting to try to keep up a charade like that. And I think that's where we see leaders burn out and turn over and move on, is when they try to come in with that false sense of like bravado, and then they try to keep the act up.
One big question I want to address, because you've written about embracing righteous anger and turning anger into curiosity. We're all angry from time to time, and anger is normal and it is healthy, and it can actually be turned into something that is positive, right? So can you talk a little bit about this? I think it makes a lot of sense. So can you expand on that idea of embracing righteous anger and turning it into curiosity?
So it's something that through my master's studies, I started to examine a little bit more. And it stems from, there was a class I took where there was a big focus on this thing called adult development theory. And so within adult development theory, and you can Google this, there's 2 great like Medium articles that explain adult development theory if you don't want to dig into like the intellectual academic texts. But adult development theory essentially is that we don't stop developing once we reach adulthood, and there are kind of these different stages of development for adults. And, some people are in like lower, and that's not meant to be a bad thing, but lower stages than others. And the needs of the people in a stage, the needs and their desires, and also the way that they interact with people is different. And so there's a great book called Immunity to Change written by Robert Keegan, and he goes into this a little bit more about just the different adult development stages, why change is so hard. And when we were in this class learning about this adult development theory, the professor said something that has stuck with me ever since. And she said that one of the greatest indicators of where we are in our development is how conscious we are in the space between being stimulated by something and our response to it. And that really stuck with me because I started thinking about for me, I don't know if you have done the Enneagram, and I'm not super deep into it, but what I can tell you is I did the Enneagram. I was like an 8 wing 7, although like real hard 3 tendencies. I don't know how that works, but what I saw on like some Enneagram diagram or wheel or something was like the 8 wing 7's response is anger. And I was like, oh, snap, there it is. Like, yes, that is me. And I think if you talked to like people I work with, they would be like, no, she's cool as can be. But if you asked my husband, he'd be like, yes, yep, that's the response she has. And it's true. Like, that is my go-to response of when I feel threatened or like things are heightened, it's to be mad.
I'm also an 8, so I understand this. I want to pause right there if we can, because I think there's something really interesting. Is you talked about that the two like sides of the personality, right? Where you're with the people you work with, like, oh yeah, she's great, she's cool and everything. But you know, the few people, I'm guessing, that you allow to be very close to you and know who you are, see that anger and that fire, right? That gut side of the 8 type. And what's interesting there is that cool part, and also like everything we've talked about on this show regarding servant leadership and humility and all that stuff. That's that healthy side of the 8, right? That's that side where you have realized that you're integrating towards a 2, and that you actually do care about other people and want to care about other people. And if you're like me, a lot of times the anger that comes up is because those people you care about are threatened or being challenged or being undervalued or being, you know, whatever. And so it's not necessarily that you're angry at a specific person or at a specific situation. You're just angry for a lot of people and for a lot of the things that are going on, because it's injustice, right? There's something that's not happening that should be happening. And it feels, it's just a giant challenge.
Yeah. So on the unhealthy 8 side, you know, when you have anger that's unexamined and you don't have that pause or that space between being stimulated and your response, that's when you see things like the nastygrams that show up in your email, or the people who spout off to you on social media, or the person who will run into your office and yell. And so I think the challenge of anger is examining it, and it's not letting it be something that is, like you were saying, directed solely at a person, but it's using righteous anger of, you know, things that are unjust, and also recognizing, I think, for me, righteous anger as a woman, a lot of the time when we're raised, and I know I'm not the only woman who experiences this, but you're raised and you don't want to rock the boat. You want to be the good girl. You want to follow the rules. You want to make everybody comfortable. And so you don't acknowledge the righteous anger or things that are upsetting you. And I think that's super unhealthy. And so it's like, how do we make sure that when we're angry, we're embracing it and using it in a way that is for good? And it's a powerful emotion.
Anger for anger's sake usually just destroys stuff. And if you have no way to channel that into rebuilding or causing good change, then it's a very destructive thing.
Exactly. And I think you can use the trick of the space between stimulus and response for a lot of different emotions. So you can use it for anxiety, you can use it for sadness. Just thinking, you know, reflecting on our own emotions in real time can often slow down that feeling that you need to react immediately. And I think slow decision making can be a really good thing.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something we don't highlight enough, of like allowing that slow time. You know, I often tell myself, sometimes you have to slow down to speed up, right? You've got to take a moment, step back, evaluate the situation. And sometimes, you know, we don't allow that time for ourselves in our schedules. We think we constantly have to be doing output. And especially in creative fields where, hey, some of that time where you are just pondering or examining your ideas and emotions is really productive, and it's what leads to that output. I think that's something we really have to pay close attention to and protect.
Yeah, and we should make it a normal part of what we all do, is the time to reflect and time away from our computers and desks. And I took my last class that I took at Gonzaga was a class on foresight and strategy, and it actually really messed me up. It was like a really deep class. I expected going in like, okay, they're going to give me like checklists of how to build strategy or something like that. But instead, the entire class was like this deeply reflective experience of, how do you go in to solve for the outside? And so we meditated like 3 times a day. We started every class was you're supposed to do a solo walk in nature with no distractions. And I hadn't slowed down for so long that it really messed me up. I cried every single day of the class. I cried for about a month afterwards. But it was a good stark reminder for me of what I was not doing for myself and for my team.
I think after listening to this podcast, everyone needs to stop, take your earbuds out, get away from your screen, pause and reflect on what we've all learned today. I think I'm going to go do that right now. But first, Jenny, can you please let people know where they can find you? Where can they find you on social, your website, all that good stuff?
So you can find me at I am Jenny Petty on Twitter. I'm always happy to chat with folks about their careers. So feel free to reach out to me there, or you can find me on LinkedIn. And I love meeting folks in and out of higher ed. So I love people and would love to meet more folks. So reach out.
Once again, we want to thank Jenny Petty for being on the show. Thanks, Jenny, for bringing your smarts and chatting with us.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much for listening to the Thought Feeder podcast. If you enjoy our show, you can listen to all of the back episodes at thoughtfeederpod.com, where we also have transcripts for every episode. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. We are definitely listed there. And if we're not, let me know on Twitter and I will fix it. You can also follow us on Twitter at ThoughtFeedPod. Thought Feeder is a production of Bravery Media.